If you've played FPS shooters, you've probably played these two titles. Two giant game franchises in a metaphorical war to provide the best FPS experience. This is the story of the forever rivals, Call of Duty and Battlefield. The early years. All right, so it's the early 2000s and World War II stories are huge in media at the time. A couple of years prior, those in media and content creation decided that nearly 60 years was enough time between World War II and now. Surely, at this point, people would love to relive that time virtually, of course. And oh boy, were they right. The release of Saving Private Ryan in 1998 sparked a surge of World War II content. This was followed by the release of the very first Medal of Honor video game, Medal of Honor Allied Assault, in 1999 by game developers 2015 Inc. A game which would be an incredible success in its own right. Not to be outdone, the video game company DICE would jump on the hype train, and in 2002, they would release Battlefield 1942. 1942 was a PC exclusive and allowed you to take part in an even, by today's standards, large-scale battle against other online players and CPU alike. You could play as an infantry ground trooper, spraying and praying to your heart's desire, or something that would be a mainstay and a huge selling point for the Battlefield franchise. Drive vehicles such as planes, tanks, helicopters, and truly command the sky or the ground. Meanwhile, like we had talked about, 2015 Inc. decided they didn't feel like contracting for EA any longer, being able to see the future and understand what kind of company EA really was. So they decided to start their own little company known as Infinity Ward. They would quickly be acquired by Activision, a company that would go on to have no controversies at all. And they were off to the races with their first release in 2003, Call of Duty. Similar to Battlefield 1942 before it, it was a massive success, introducing a more fast-paced arcade-style alternative to other games in the genre, while also incorporating some of the best elements of both 1942 and Medal of Honor. The game contained intense single-player missions and a fast-paced multiplayer that would set the standard for what the franchise would become in years to come. Following the success of Battlefield 1942, the modding community for the game absolutely exploded, and none were bigger than Trauma Studios' mod, Desert Combat. It provided even more content in what was already, for the time, a pretty massive game. Take a guess at how DICE responded to the Trauma Studios and their incredibly popular mod. A, did they send a squad to dispatch of the creators? B, send a cease and desist letter to shut down the mod? C, be super impressed and hire Trauma Studios to help them create Battlefield 2? Well, if you guessed C, you'd be correct. They hired this super impressive modding studio to assist them in making Battlefield 2. A desert-based combat would be the focus of this game. Activision would never do such a thing. Battlefield 2 was released in 2005 and ventured into the modern day, deciding that perhaps people would be more interested in taking part in the conflict that was currently happening instead of one 60 years in the past. Battlefield 2 is still considered to be one of the best releases in the series to date, introducing several new features that are included in even brand new releases of Battlefield. It introduced the first iteration of Commander Mode, allowing a player to send orders via the map to squad leaders on how they should progress throughout the game. Battlefield 2 also refined vehicle combat. Realizing that it was an incredibly popular aspect of the first game, they made sure to put a focus on the utilization of vehicles in the sequel. In 2005, we also witnessed the first direct release competition between Battlefield and Call of Duty. Activision, in the same year, released Call of Duty 2. The game stuck with World War II era, but refined the previous COD formula to perfection. It featured a wonderful campaign that followed 4 different soldiers in World War II, and a very well-received multiplayer mode containing many classic game modes from modern titles: Search and Destroy, TDM, Capture the Flag, among others. The multiplayer was so good that it spawned a competitive scene that for a time was seen as a true challenger to Counter-Strike. Back then, and now, was still a dominant force in the scene. Both game developers seriously stepped up their game, literally and figuratively. And in our first matchup, it really does come down to preference. However, Call of Duty seemed to have hit a wider audience at the time due to its fast-paced style and incredible offline mode, something in which Battlefield was lacking at the time. Following a massive 2005 for both DICE and Activision, the companies attempted to capitalize on the hype surrounding their games by both releasing again the following year, marketing yet another head-to-head matchup between the two FPS titans, pun intended. And boy, did both companies totally not live up to expectations. DICE would follow up Battlefield 2 with Battlefield 2142, set in, you guessed it, the future. Decided that surely fans were done with these current warfare games and that it was time to give people something to look forward to in the future, more war. But this time with robots. The reception of this game was okay. Generally speaking, the mechanics and gameplay of the game were well received. It still felt like Battlefields of old, just with some added mechs, titans, EMPs, and hover vehicles galore. Like I said, players didn't hate the way the game felt. They just perhaps felt as though it just wasn't the era they were trying to play. Now, from changing too much to not changing nearly enough, just a month later, Activision released the much anticipated Call of Duty 3. The primary difference between this game and the previous two installments was the introduction of soon-to-be fan-favorite Call of Duty developer Treyarch. Treyarch had worked alongside Infinity Ward here and there during the creation of the first two installments, but this was the time for them to showcase what they could do themselves, and it fell a bit flat. Similar to Battlefield a month prior, people were not necessarily saying the game was bad. However, as if completely opposite of Battlefield, Call of Duty 3 just didn't simply change enough from the previous titles to warrant any kind of genuine excitement. A swing and a miss from both sides for the first time. Let's call it a mulligan and move on, because if you know anything about either of these franchises, you know the best is still yet to come. Perhaps even just in a year's time. The prime years. Battlefield decided to take 2007 off while they were cooking up some bangers for the next couple years. However, the Call of Duty train doesn't stop, and they chose 2007 as their release date for the greatest release to date. Well, according to certain people. The greatest release they've ever put out was Infinity Ward's magnum opus, Modern Warfare, which, if you didn't gather by the title of the game, was Call of Duty's first venture into the current era conflict. Anyone complaining that Call of Duty wasn't innovating anymore because of Call of Duty 3 was doing so no longer. A cinematic masterpiece with intense missions made up the campaign, one that many people still revisit to this day. The multiplayer experience in COD 4 is one that would set the standard not only for Call of Duty moving forward, but for any other video game developer looking to delve into the genre. Now, remember how I mentioned that Battlefield was lacking in the single player department? Well, just you wait, because it's 2008 and Battlefield Bad Company just dropped. And it's not only got a single player campaign, but it's pretty good. Bad Company sees DICE put a genuine focus on the single player for this game, with character development at an all-time high and some memorable characters filled with personality. And they were not done there either. Bad Company also marks the debut of the infamous Frostbite engine, allowing for wildly improved graphics as well as patented Battlefield destructible environments, an engine that will continue to be improved on as time goes on. Battlefield just didn't return to form with Bad Company. It ran it all the way for a touchdown, taking perhaps the biggest step in improvement from one game to the next so far in its franchise's history. Now, not to be outdone, Call of Duty also released some heat this year. Treyarch is back, and they had more than learned from their previous attempt. Despite the success of Modern Warfare, Treyarch opted to return to World War II with a campaign that players claim was the most realistic portrayal of World War II in franchise history so far. The multiplayer also brought the fun Call of Duty experience that we all know and love. But the real highlight of World at War came from the debut of the most iconic second game mode Call of Duty would ever release. A game mode that Treyarch would use to truly separate themselves from Infinity Ward and provide themselves with their own style. I'm talking about zombies. That would be a mainstay for Treyarch moving forward. In large part, Battlefield 1943, released in 2009, was an expansion of Battlefield 1942, but released on console. The game, however, did have some improvements over previous releases, most notably an enhancement in the Frostbite engine. The changes allowed not only for pieces of the environment to be destructible, but entire buildings, a massive spectacle that was appreciated by the Battlefield fanbase. Besides this, the game, while smaller in scale than several of the more previous PC releases, still provided a fun and disorderly feeling of Battlefield combat that was enjoyable for most. On the other side of our rivalry, Call of Duty still can't seem to miss. In 2009, they dropped once again a favorite in the COD community. Modern Warfare 2 takes all that was great about the original Modern Warfare and does it all again. Some may say they did it even better. The continuation of the single-player story, with even more sublime storytelling and crazy intense cinematic moments, it all came together to make a top Call of Duty of all time. The multiplayer once again doesn't slack behind the single player either, with perhaps the greatest multiplayer experience in the history of the franchise. Iconic maps from Rust to Terminal to High Rise, memorable weapons from the Intervention and all the crazy trick shots that have been hit with it, the ACR and all the competitive matches won with that insane assault rifle, and a couple of questionable inclusions, but ones that are memorable all the same, such as the Noob Tube one-shotting you from across the map and the dual model 1887s, which were one-shotting you from across the map. And who could forget the classic Commando Pro knife combo, also one-shotting you from across the map. What a game this was, an absolute classic. Now, perhaps the single greatest matchup in these two franchises' storied rivalry, certainly the best matchup to this point, in terms of the quality of both games, hype, and expectation for each release, it's hard to top Battlefield 2 versus Black Ops 1. As has been the norm for the last several releases, DICE decided to take a near-perfect product and somehow make it better. Perhaps the greatest Battlefield game ever released. Definitely the greatest single-player story Battlefield has ever released. The graphics rival anything that was being put out at this point. An amazing sequel to the previous Bad Company story, and a multiplayer that introduced a deathmatch game mode and a rush game mode, and both of those provided fast-paced action similar to Call of Duty. This game was the real full package of an FPS experience. DICE truly pulled out all the stops to provide its player base with everything they could have wanted in a Battlefield game. Now, from everything you could want in one game to the start of the most iconic franchise in COD history, Treyarch returns with the first installment of the Black Ops series. Remember all that good stuff I said about World at War? Well, take all that and make it even better. And that's what you get with Black Ops 1. Treyarch continued with huge leaps in game quality by providing improved multiplayer, more memorable weapons, well-designed and fun maps, alongside an improved zombies experience, coupled with the start of the zombie story and the introduction of Easter eggs, which are creative and interactive ways for you to progress the story throughout your classic round-based experience. So, choosing between them is near impossible. So good luck. Now we go from potentially the best matchup quality-wise to the most hyped matchup of this rivalry. A battle of trilogies. Battlefield returns to its main series after a few successful detours for their last couple of releases. And Infinity Ward sticks with what has been working with the third installment of the Modern Warfare franchise. DICE follows up Bad Company 2, which had likely the best single-player story in any Battlefield game, with a game that many Battlefield veterans would consider the best multiplayer in a Battlefield game. Battlefield 3 also marked the introduction of the Frostbite 2 engine, which, along with introducing a suppressive fire and vehicle disabling, and also improving the graphics tremendously. Call of Duty soon followed with their most anticipated release to date. And for the first time in many years, Call of Duty tripped up, and by many people's standards, missed the mark. Now, it wasn't completely their fault. Two main developers for Infinity Ward during development left to form a different game development studio, which you may know, Respawn Studios, leaving a very large void in a company that they would struggle to fill. The hype behind the release of Modern Warfare 3 still resulted in it being a huge commercial success. However, the anticipation for a jump in quality from MW2 may have been MW3's downfall. Instead of taking a huge step forward, it felt very similar to previous entries in the series, which isn't necessarily a bad thing given how well received those titles were before, but Modern Warfare 3 included far fewer memorable weapons and maps and modes compared to the top games in the series. Now, the game wasn't all bad though. It did bolster a good single player experience and did give us the introduction of the game mode called Survival. In terms of expectations versus reality, many would consider this as a rare miss for the Call of Duty franchise. But if you ask around, you may still find people who have this in their short list as their favorite COD titles. In 2012, Battlefield once again took the year off. However, despite this, I would be doing a disservice by not at least mentioning that Call of Duty decided to use this year to release another top 3 Call of Duty of all time. These second installments in these COD series really make you feel as though COD is unstoppable. Everything great about Black Ops 1 is here, except it has better multiplayer, a better campaign, and of course, the Treyarch special, better zombies. This game was a whole package. The moment in time the kids would refer to as peak COD. In 2013, both franchises experienced a challenging year, not in the way they would have hoped. Coming off great receptions of their previous releases, with Infinity Ward specifically primed to rebound from a lackluster MW3, both sides did not hit the ground running. Battlefield 4 released with a lot of problems, bugs, and glitches galore, with connection errors that would have had the best of us chucking our consoles out the window. DICE put a lot of work into fixing the game, and in its current state, it's considered to be a community favorite. However, not everyone in the player base was willing to give the game a second chance, so it never truly reached the heights of the previous year's releases. The unfortunate part is that the game actually provided a lot in terms of community support, with test servers allowing people to play and give feedback on future builds. It also popularized the only in Battlefield meme that you will still see circulating around the community whenever a Battlefield release is imminent. Now, 2013 saw the release of the controversial Call of Duty Ghosts. A couple times in the past, Call of Duty would release a game that was just okay in people's eyes, not doing anything offensive, but also not innovating in a way that got people excited like they did with the super successes in the franchise. COD Ghost is the first release in the franchise where you would catch members of the community saying it was bad. A campaign would only be classified as decent was the highlight of this game. The multiplayer was uninspiring and just boring. Attempts to make things interesting by introducing dynamic map elements fell flat as the maps themselves were just too big for their own good and just drab. It felt as if the developers just said, make it yellow or make it gray and do nothing else. Throw in a second game mode, Extinction, that was perhaps fun for a few runs, but it just felt like Infinity Ward attempting and failing to capture the magic of zombies. And you have Call of Duty's first genuine disappointment in franchise history. Now, in the year 2014, Call of Duty ventured in a different direction, entering what is known as today as the jetpack era. Along with this era came the introduction of a new developer known as Sledgehammer Games. The game was fittingly named Advanced Warfare and was the first venture into the far-off future since Battlefield 2142 nearly 10 years ago. Activision had heard the complaints about a lack of innovation being placed on several of the previous releases, and they listened, taking on people finally being ready to move on from modern and old school combat and head to the time of lasers and robots. Battlefield did it too early. Now is the time, and they were kind of wrong. Similar to Battlefield 2142, the game was anticipated by some for the attempts to try something different, but not everyone in the community really liked this kind of difference. Whether you liked it or not though, Jetpack COD in a futuristic setting were here to stay for a long time. While Call of Duty was busy time traveling to the future, Battlefield was using that time of the year to make their own step in a different direction. That step came in 2015 with the release of Battlefield Hardline. Hardline decided to scrap the war-based combat altogether and instead opted for some good old cops and robbers. The game is very hit or miss with the community. On one hand, it was an interesting concept, and the single player campaign being somewhat of a cop drama was fun to some, but not the most memorable story for the fan base, and not one that many will revisit too often either. The multiplayer also had some fun new features and game modes to fit the cops and robbers aesthetic. However, the decision to remove many of the large-scale vehicles that Battlefield had become known for didn't sit well with the player base. The game provided a fun experience for many, but this was not the direction the community wanted the franchise to continue going forward. 2015 also saw the return of Treyarch and the return of the Black Ops series, a series that has been the most reliable for Activision and COD fans alike. So expectations were high for Treyarch to once again deliver, and yeah, they did it again. Don't get me wrong, Treyarch choosing to stick to a futuristic setting and keep jetpacks in the game didn't sit well with many boots on the ground enthusiasts, but in terms of how to deliver a jetpack COD, this was about as good as you could hope for. They refined the Advanced Warfare futuristic movement system and made it even better, introducing wall running as well as power sliding, movement that even the biggest of COD haters have to admit was fun to zip around with. The multiplayer overall was a fun experience with interesting guns that were futuristic but didn't venture nearly as far as Advanced Warfare did, some memorable maps, as well as the return of several old school maps from previous entries in the series, starting a tradition, for better or for worse, will become the norm moving forward. This game also saw one of the biggest years for the competitive scene for COD, having some of the biggest pre-Call of Duty League prize pools and viewer bases. Of course, it wouldn't be a Treyarch game without zombies, and they once again upped the ante with the most ambitious zombies experience to date, with absolutely massive maps, with incredible Easter eggs, and the introduction of gobblegums, gumballs that would provide various rewards or buffs that would alter the way each run was played. After the yearly life cycle of this game, they even released a bonus DLC known as the Zombie Chronicles, which remastered 8 classic zombies maps. A controversial title indeed, but one that was accepted by the community. The player base had their fun so long as Call of Duty finally returns to its boots on the ground roots and all would be forgiven. In 2016, Battlefield released the first game in the series. Oh wait, never mind. They just decided to name the game Battlefield 1 because the game takes place in World War I. Yeah, that's not confusing at all. Anyways, 2016 would see the first matchup between these two rivals that saw some true separation between quality of games. Battlefield released not only a return to form, but a return to a largely unexplored war throughout both of these franchises. On the other hand, Call of Duty would experience a nosedive like they'd never had before. Battlefield 1 would be a massive success for DICE. People loved that the game took place during World War I, and the multiplayer included massive maps that allowed for a feeling of war like no other game released before it. The campaign was also sectioned into what are known as war stories, which saw you play as different soldiers on various fronts of the war, experiencing what they went through and battling through tense missions while learning their story along the way. People had their complaints with the connection and with some glitches and bugs on launch, something which seems to be constant with the new Battlefield releases as they continued trying up the scale. However, these complaints were not nearly as prevalent as Battlefield 4 prior. Plus, the hype behind the game perhaps made people a bit more forgiving. A surge in interest in Battlefield 1 this year almost certainly was in part due to the massive drop in interest in Infinity Ward's Infinite Warfare. The reveal trailer for Infinite Warfare just a few weeks after release became the second most disliked video on YouTube. If you're wondering where all this hatred came from, it's pretty simple. Remember how much of the player base was done with futuristic Call of Duties? Well, instead of returning to boots on the ground, Infinity Ward decided to take a step even further into the future. Perhaps the most futuristic release yet. Jetpacks were back and the movement system was pretty much the same as Black Ops 3. The map designs were a little bit more forgettable and some of them were kind of awful. Take all the visual complaints about COD Ghosts and imagine them here, but set in a time period that almost nobody wanted. Now, I gotta give the game credit where it deserves. The campaign was actually really good. The people that decided to actually give the campaign a try, most of them claim it was one of the best single player experiences in the last several COD releases. However, a good campaign was not enough to save a game that was seemingly doomed to fail from the start. In an attempt to boost pre-orders of the game, Infinity Ward decided also to couple the release of Infinite Warfare with a remaster of the original Modern Warfare from all the way back in 2007. While this may have worked in terms of increasing pre-orders and sales, what this actually accomplished was providing a pre-order bonus that overshadowed the game it was coupled with. What Activision and Infinity Ward likely should have expected, but not what they wanted. Many COD veterans can attest that Call of Duty had reached an all-time low in terms of reputation at this point. In 2018, we once again find ourselves with another controversial matchup, as the consistent reputation of incredible releases from both sides has transformed into a coin flip of quality each time. Battlefield 5 would release with many similarities to Battlefield 1, some would say too many similarities. The player base claimed that the game was rushed out too soon to capitalize on a few things. The first being the popularity of Battlefield 1, trying to strike while the iron was still hot, resulting in an incredible lack of innovation between the two games. The second thing DICE wanted to capitalize on was the popularity of Battle Royale games, such as Fortnite at the time, attempting to release a Battle Royale mode of their own, known as Firestorm. However, this mode was dead on arrival, with several serious game-breaking issues that would likely double the length of this video if we went into all of them at the same time. Unlike Battlefield 4, which also launched with many issues, Battlefield 5 was never really able to recover from its problems and remains a release that fans would likely rather just forget about. Call of Duty would release yet another installment in the Black Ops franchise, but this time, Treyarch couldn't quite clean up the mess that had been made to at the one point unbreakable COD reputation. One upside is that the previous release by Sledgehammer, Call of Duty World War II, Call of Duty finally saw a return to boots on the ground. Now, Black Ops 4 stuck with this formula, but various additions all added up to a lackluster multiplayer experience that some people loved and some people hated. The game had an incredibly high time to kill, mixed with rapidly regenerating stim shots, made nearly everyone a bullet sponge. Otherwise, it was just a very normal approach to multiplayer that players have started to grow tired of. Black Ops 4 was the first entry to release without a campaign, opting to replace it and join Battlefield in the Battle Royale genre with Blackout. The difference between Blackout and Firestorm being, Blackout was actually playable and pretty fun. It was everything that the Battlefield fans had hoped for with Firestorm. But back to Black Ops 4, the lack of a campaign was definitely a controversial topic, but Blackout being a success likely allowed Treyarch to get away with it. Now, the most recent head-to-head matchup between these two rivals, we finished in the exact opposite position as we started. We've come from a massive release sequels in Battlefield 2 and Call of Duty 2, which took the formula established in the original and improved it dramatically, to 2021, where both DICE and Activision are releasing potentially the worst game in both franchises. Battlefield 2042 had an incredible reveal, and the hype surrounding this game was astonishing. Slightly futuristic combat that still felt modern, only in Battlefield moments galore. It felt like Battlefield was about to truly run away with this rivalry and take the top spot in the FPS genre for good. Now, when I say this, I'm not exaggerating. Battlefield 2042 may have had the worst launch in a video game's history, almost as if you had taken every complaint about the previous Battlefield game launches, from connection, network errors, hit registration problems, literally just going around the map without some sort of game-altering bug or experiencing a game crash. Not to mention overpowered vehicles and attachments that didn't come close to doing what they were intended to do when placed on a weapon. The game took the biggest hype train they had ever had and squandered it big time. I would say that Call of Duty Vanguard didn't do nearly as bad, but that is simply for the expectations of Call of Duty. They were at an all-time low at this point. Another release by Sledgehammer, who still hadn't released a COD game that a fan base would consider a masterpiece like some of the original Modern Warfare or Black Ops titles. Vanguard would not be that title for Sledgehammer. To start, the campaign was filled with massive inaccuracies, like weaponry and attachments that absolutely did not exist in World War II. How a franchise that has released several World War II games at this point could get this wrong is beyond my understanding. Not to mention that over the last few years, COD had been transitioning into a more realistic style of game with the 2019 release of Modern Warfare. Yes, Modern Warfare, not to be confused with Modern Warfare from 2007 or the remaster of 2007. This is a game released in 2017. Anyway, regardless, Call of Duty has entered a realism era, The games had much improved graphics and gunplay that was closer to the Battlefield style. Vanguard, however, just looked awful in comparison, and it played awful as well. Ping and packet loss problems mixed with a super fast time to kill would make it feel like you died well around the corner one life, or feel like you got one shot at another life. The attempted zombies in a forgettable campaign are not even worth mentioning at this point. A boring experience and a sad effort from a $1 billion franchise on its 18th release. So where are we in 2024? And where does this rivalry go from here? Both franchises still have some work to do to recover from the recent loss of community trust. Honestly, they seem to be trying. DICE is yet to release another title since Battlefield 2042. However, similarly to what they did with Battlefield 4, a lot of effort from the dev team has resulted in a product closer to what the fan base was hyped about at reveal. Unlike Battlefield 4, the game has actually seen a bit of a resurgence, as the FPS genre has really been one for the taking in the last couple of years due to consistent disappointments from nearly every FPS developer. The present for DICE is looking up, and if they can take the time to release a working title that doesn't fall apart on release, I can see them surely finding a second wind and finding their way back to the top of the mountain. The other half of the rivalry, Call of Duty, the franchise that, despite disappointments, seemingly refuses to fall in terms of commercial success. Until recently, in 2022, Call of Duty released Modern Warfare 2, not to be confused with the good one back in 2009, and this release contains so many problems that the sales figures between the 2019 version of Modern Warfare had dropped 60%. This seemingly lit a fire for Activision, as several leaks have teased a potential return for a more classic Call of Duty feel. Something that, if executed correctly, could see a revitalization of the interest in this series and provide a hit of nostalgia that could save the franchise from the free fall it's found itself in. Both of these legendary franchises have experienced their fair shares of ups and downs. Surprisingly, they seem to share these moments, with very few instances where one franchise separates itself from the other one. When one struggles, the other somehow meets it at the same level. When one rediscovers what made themselves great and releases a masterclass, the other finds that same spark to do the same. Locked in an intense battle at the top of the FPS world, they're now still throwing haymakers at each other in a joint nosedive. After everything they've been through together, the question remains: will they grasp and claw at each other to return to relevancy, or will both continue to fail? Thanks for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Comment which one you playing, Battlefield or Call of Duty, and we'll see you in the next one.